For some, the discussion about security is a nice intellectual discussion to be having. For us, it's an existential issue.
The Finnish policy is rooted in historical experience. Over the years, we have maintained our national capabilities. We never let our guard down.
We are all well familiar with the concept of total defense. This means that our military and civilian structures, together with the private sector and civil society, are acting as one.
Welcome to the Helsinki Security Forum, Helsinki Security Forum, the Total Defense Edition. There's no apathy allowed here, but we all have to contribute to the action part of building a European and transatlantic total defense for the 21st century. I'm Charly Salonius-Pasternak. I will be the MC for the afternoon. At FIIA, I lead our US research and focus on regional security and defense. And for those keeping score, also one of the many, many Finnish reservists in this room, since we're talking about total defense. Now, it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here, but also new faces, because as we're planning the Helsinki Security Forum, we always want to make sure there's enough of the old familiar so that people are comfortable, but also ensure that there's something new, that all of you, all of the participants, as well as the people following us over the stream, walk away from this weekend with some new ideas, some inspiration, some idea of how to make our societies more secure. Now, this afternoon's opening session is an interview of President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, by the Financial Times Brussels Bureau Chief, Henry Foy. This will be followed by our first full panel on towards a total defense of Europe. Before that, though, we actually need the opening remarks. And to do that, I would like to invite on stage the acting director, Dr. Mikael Mattlin. He will be followed by Klaus Korhonen. He's the chair of the FIIA board, as well as Finland's former ambassador to NATO. As Mikael walks up here, he's the acting director. He's been the acting deputy director. He's also led the Institute's Center on Global Orders in China. He's been a professor of political science at the University of Turku and a professor of Chinese studies at the University of Helsinki. Mikael, take it away.
Thank you, Charlie. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the year 2024 has underscored the urgent need for a comprehensive and proactive approach to defending Europe in the face of a grim security situation and proliferating geopolitical uncertainties. The current state of the world provides a sobering backdrop for the third annual Helsinki Security Forum. This year's forum brings together thought leaders, policymakers and experts to address the conference theme. In Finland, we have long talked about comprehensive security. The concept signifies that we need to be prepared to deal with any disruption, be it a broken oil tanker in the Finnish Gulf, a pandemic disease like COVID-19, or a military conflict. In preparing for such eventualities, seamless cooperation between government authorities is a great advantage. And perhaps even more importantly, close and flexible cooperation between the government, the business sector, non-governmental organizations, and all citizens. It is very much a whole of government and a whole of society approach to security. A broad understanding of resilience where every member of society in principle has a role to play. The concept of total defense, which we use in the title of this year's forum, may be more familiar to our distinguished foreign guests. Total defense is also about a wide range of activities and actors, but the focus is clearly on preparing for hybrid attacks and, in the worst case, a full-scale war. How can society support the efforts of military defense? How can society survive and function under attack? In fact, the total defense concept is very close to NATO's understanding of resilience. Whatever our approach to resilience, we need international cooperation, which supports and complements national efforts. We need solidarity, and we must be ready to show solidarity to others. This is a European question. It is a transatlantic question. It is also a global question. The Helsinki Security Forum continues to solidify its role as a leading Northern European platform for high-level dialogue on security and defense matters. With each passing year, the forum's influence grows, and so too does the urgency of the issues it addresses. Our discussions during this year's forum will delve into, among others, the future of the European security architecture, the Russia factor in European security, the role of the defense industry in securing Europe, climate security, military use of AI and its governance, protecting critical infrastructure, and many more. These are all questions that we study at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. In our interconnected and increasingly complex world, FIIA's work is more vital than ever. This year, HSF will benefit from the support of more partners than ever before. The involvement of our partners is crucial for the success of the forum. Their contributions will enhance the depth of the discussions. And I would like here to express my gratitude for your commitment. The future of European security depends on our collective ability to move from discussion to action. Given the significance of the forum participants present here today, the HSF is not merely a venue for debate, but a catalyst for enhancing European security. Through joint commitment, close collaboration, and appropriate burden sharing, we can build a more resilient and secure Europe. On behalf of myself and the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, welcome to the Helsinki Security Forum 2024. I would now like to ask Ambassador Klaus on stage. Mr. Korhonen is currently the Ambassador for Policy Planning at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland. He is also a chairman of the board of FIIA. He was previously Ambassador of Finland to NATO 2019 to 2023, and after Finland's accession to the alliance, the first Finnish permanent representative to NATO. He has also previously served as Ambassador for Arms Control at the MFA, and he was also President of the International Arms Trade Treaty, among many other duties. Mr. Korhonen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mikael, for your words, and also thank you for the good work as the acting director of FIIA. Of course, also on my behalf, warm welcome to the third edition of Helsinki Security Forum. We have a wonderful program, and already at this stage, I want to thank everybody who is contributing to it. Now, in recent years, FIIA has become an increasingly visible and prominent European research institute. FIIA has also grown in terms of personnel, and I want to thank the former FIIA director Mikael for his crucial role in the development of the institute. A lot has happened since we met here in Helsinki last year. Mika is now a member of the European Parliament, and the board has conducted recently a thorough process to select a new director. We have chosen Professor Hiski Haukkala, and Hiski will start at the helm of FIIA on the 1st of November. Many of you know him, and I think with his broad experience, Hiski will provide the visionary and dynamic leadership that the Institute needs in the coming year. You will hear more about HELSINKI and his views this evening over the dinner. Mikael covered many topics of our forum. The main focus during these 3 days will be on resilience, the ability of our societies to cope with crises and to recover from them, and on what is the role of European and transatlantic cooperation and solidarity in this effort. Here, many lessons can be drawn from Ukraine's resistance against Russian aggression. The question that certainly comes up as well in many panels is how can we best continue supporting Ukraine in the fight for its security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce our first guest, President Alexander Stubb. He will discuss with Henry Foy, who is the Brussels Bureau Chief of Financial Times. The strength of our democracy is an important dimension of societal resilience. In the Helsinki Security Forum last year, 2023, Dr. Stubb was one of the presidential candidates who were interviewed in the pre-conference event up there in the Sky Room bar, top floor. Subsequently, in February, he was elected as the 13th President of the Republic of Finland and assumed office 1st of March this year. The Finnish presidential campaign of the 9 candidates was remarkable in being very polite, constructive, and respectful. The campaign presented an alternative to the rather polarized and negative political culture which dominates a large part of the Euro-Atlantic area and which is not unknown in Finland either. Before the presidency, Dr. Stubb had a political career as Prime Minister and Foreign Minister and had other ministerial posts. He has served as member of the Finnish Parliament and also of the European Parliament. He has also been a Vice President of the European Investment Bank. Dr. Stubb holds a PhD from London School of Economics and has an academic background as a professor in College of Europe and in the European University Institute. Mr. President, Henry, it's really great to have you, both of you here, and the stage is yours. Thank you.
Whichever one you want. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Charly, Klaus, Mikael, for the great introductions. Mr. President, thank you so much for coming and agreeing to chat, especially given you came straight off the plane from New York. Good to know that the UN General Assembly remains the warm-up event for the Helsinki Security Forum.
Yeah, I feel very fresh. I apologize in advance if my cognitive capacity today is suboptimal. So.
I wanted to kick off with New York. Mikael there just described the global environment as grim. How's the global conversation? What are people talking about? What was the feeling there?
Well, I guess, usually when you come out of these, we're there for 5 days, 5 full days. You sort of, you're asked, what are your takeaways? And I guess in this particular case, the sort of bad news or cause for pessimism, but then good news and cause for optimism. The bad news, of course, is that we have 3 major wars ranging in the world, one in Europe, one in the Middle East, and one in Africa. So Ukraine, Palestine, and Sudan. And one could, I guess, safely say that there was no real progress on those, albeit there was a good call for a ceasefire in Lebanon by G7 and 3 Arab states. Albeit there were good conversations about Sudan, and Zelensky had a very strong proposal for a victory plan. But the good news, or the reason, the cause for optimism, is that I sort of came out of the week thinking that there's a chance that multilateralism will be back. And it started with this Pact on the Future, which was approved on Monday. Interestingly enough, it was the African state that pushed it through the finish line, isolating Russia, Belarus, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela. And this to me was, a sign of something. So, I had a chance, about 15, 20 leaders, mainly from the global south, and I was trying to push the idea that multipolarity, which Russia and China to a certain extent are talking about, that leads to disorder. But multilateralism actually leads to cooperation and order. So, it was 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, as these UN meetings usually are. But I did come out of there probably more optimistic than I expected.
Keen to talk about Zelensky and how he was, but in terms of the attitudes towards Ukraine, did you notice any shift compared to over the last 6 months, say? I mean, there's a lot more conversations I certainly pick up on about peace settlement happening almost publicly. Things that were taboo 6 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, 2 observations on that. First, I think we, especially in the West, have to understand that there's a clear connection between the war in Ukraine and the war in Palestine. And we can see this in voting patterns already. So if you look at the beginning of the war, it was, if I recall correctly, 141 in favor of Ukraine, 35 abstaining, and 4 against. Now, the latest vote that we had on Ukraine was on nuclear safety, which, should be pretty self-evident with Zaporizhzhia and the rest of it. And that was only 99 in favor of Ukraine, roughly 60 abstained, and then 14, 15 against. So there's a clear shift, and in all the conversations that I had with especially leaders from the global south and partially the global east as well, they said, listen, there's an element of double standards here. You talk about territorial integrity, sovereignty, you talk about international law with Ukraine, but you sort of are a little bit more quiet about it when it comes to Palestine. So there was that link. Now on Ukraine, did I sense war fatigue? Not really, but we all do understand that the American elections are looming. There was a package of roughly $8 billion coming from the Biden administration. There was bipartisan support, but then some pushback, obviously, from Donald Trump. I had a chance to talk with Zelensky. I think it was my 6th meeting with him in 6 months. So we talked for about half an hour, and I sensed that he was probably a little bit more optimistic than certainly what he was when we first met in April.
Optimistic about what?
Optimistic about his capacity to get what he wants, which means finance, ammunition, military equipment, and then eventually the right to use long-range missiles without any kind of limits, as long as they are for defense or within the framework of international law. So in that sense, I came out of that meeting as well optimistic. And to be honest, you can sense with leaders, are they tired? Are they worn out? I didn't sense that at all with Zelensky. There was sort of this rejuvenated president of Ukraine. And of course, what I tried to do personally, because for us, the war in Ukraine, that's our war. The foreign minister talked about foreign policy for us being existential. It is for Ukraine as well, but in many ways we focus on that right now. We try to convince the Americans to give unlimited access to long-range missiles. We try to convince the global south that if Russia is allowed to violate international law in Ukraine, acquire illegally territory, which is 20% right now, the same will happen all around the world. And then we go into this multipolar disorder. And my big fear, of course, in all of this is that the UN is pretty much absent in peace mediation. They tried in Syria, failed. They're not in Sudan. They're non-existent in Gaza, apart from UNRWA. And we don't see them in Ukraine. And when peace mediation is transactional, when there's no multilateral institutions, we very rarely get results. And that's what worries me.
I noticed quite a large push by the Indians to sort of put themselves as a global mediator on the Ukraine crisis. You've said this summer that China could end this with one phone call. Is there a risk that, I'm not saying we shouldn't outreach to the global south, but there's a risk that Europe takes a back seat and this deal is done without us?
Well, there's always that risk. 2 observations. The first one is, what did worry me a little bit was the sort of absence of China and Russia
Right.
from the UN Assembly, obviously Russia for rather obvious reasons.
Kinda hard to get a visa.
But China wasn't there. So you could see sort of probably a stronger dominance than from the US, the UK, France, and certainly also from the likes of Brazil. I've pushed for China to get involved, not because I believe in the Chinese-Brazilian six-point plan. Sure. I actually disagree with the fundamental elements of it because it doesn't talk about territorial integrity, but because China has such a stronghold on Russia right now. Yeah. So my argument is that if you talk about peaceful coexistence, harmony, and peace in general, then you need to put your money where your mouth is. Yeah. And I think President Xi's stronghold on Putin is right now so strong that he should do something about it. It'll be really interesting to see what the reaction now is from the, once again, rather aggressive rhetoric on nuclear arms coming from Putin, because the last time it happened, it was China and the global south that said, enough is enough.
Did you get a sense from Zelensky that he trusts the Chinese and Brazilians to get a deal done, or?
No, I followed his speech, which I'll be very honest with you, in the UN General Assembly, leaders don't usually follow each other's speeches, right? You have all the trainees taking notes there and the rest of it. But I went to listen to Zelensky's speech among others. On that, he had, in my mind, two things that he focused on. The first one was nuclear power, not nuclear arms. Sure. But he was very worried about his energy infrastructure, 80% already bombed. What's going to happen with Zaporizhzhia? He talked about them having intel that Russia might be making a move on the nuclear power plants. The second one was he specifically mentioned in interviews and elsewhere the Russian-Brazilian plan, and he was sort of pushing back on it. He said it's not a good starting point, but the Ukrainians are very good at this. So what I could envisage is Zelensky's 10-point plan with some kind of language coming from proposals coming from the global south and the global east, and perhaps have that as a starting point. But we're certainly not there yet.
You don't think we're anywhere near the start of these talks?
No. I mean, I was a little bit more optimistic after the Peace Forum in Switzerland in June, but I still feel that we're quite far away. The good news here, though, is that militarily, Ukraine is in a much better place than what it was in June. I'm not saying that it's over and done with. No, I mean it's critical at all times. But I do think that Kursk, whatever we think about it, I'm looking at General Jaakkola here, whatever we think about it from a military strategy perspective, I do think that it shifted the psychology of the war, and that's quite important. And I think Russia has shifted somewhere around 43,000 troops now from the eastern front up to Kursk, and they're holding fort. So we're very much in a classic stalemate, kinetic type of a situation where a lot of it comes down to your capacity to sustain loss, which is obviously horrible to say, but that's the reality.
I wanted to pivot briefly to the Middle East. I mean, you mentioned the ceasefire demand. Netanyahu basically said, no thanks. What was the reaction in New York? I mean, are people realizing they have lost control of Netanyahu?
Well, one could say that, yes, with a few caveats. But so I had a chance to speak with President Herzog on Thursday before I left. Then I met President Abbas. I met the President of Iran, which is obviously quite unusual. And then I also met the King of Jordan. And the situation there obviously is extremely tense, and I am, much like anyone else, worried about escalation. I would argue that the King of Jordan, as we saw in his speech as well, is very worried about escalation. The President of Iran, if I may, he at least did not talk about the rhetoric of escalation, albeit I was trying to push him on, what are you going to do with the Houthis? What are you going to do with Hamas? Why do you keep on supporting Hezbollah? So the Iranians are, using proxies and trying to de-escalate. But then again, Netanyahu, if I were to say he's trying to de-escalate, I think I might be pushing it a little bit. And I was quite disappointed, admittedly, that first there was language coming from Israel that they will accept the ceasefire proposal in Lebanon. And then when Netanyahu landed in New York, the language was completely different. And they're clearly preparing on our active in a land war. So the situation is very tense. De-escalation is what we're trying to do. You know, my big take on this, you know, the optimist in me says that this has simply gone too far. This must be the tipping point towards a two-state solution. The pessimist in me says that this has now gone so far that we are beyond the point of no return. I don't think anyone knows that. I think what we're probably going to see is an end to the military operation in Gaza, and therefore a focus somewhere else. Interestingly enough, if I may, we look at the opinion polls in Israel right now, and for the first time, Likud, so Netanyahu's party, is actually gone ahead and rising. At the same time, final point on this, this is probably the most emotionally draining conflict that we have in the world right now. I mean, it's mind-boggling to see, and I fully understand why, how emotionally attached people are to one side or the other. There are very few who can sort of be in between and take a helicopter view on it. I struggle to do that myself, but I keep on saying that for a country like Finland, it's very important that we're not pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. We are pro-peace. We're pro a solution. But of course, we don't have the keys to that solution. We can just support from the sidelines.
I mean, no more than in the US, right? And the impact it could have on that.
Well, the US has a slightly bigger role in this conflict, as in many other conflicts, than Finland has. And they, of course, can work on it. But I could also sense a little bit in the corridor certain frustrations right now with Israel. Once again, if you looked at the street, what were the demonstrations in New York? It was all about Palestine.
Yeah. You talked a lot in New York about Russian hybrid attacks and about the need for Europe to remain vigilant and strong. Do you expect these hybrid attacks to increase as the winter rolls on, as Ukraine becomes a much more difficult fight for them, and they bring incidents to Europe that would divide populations?
I say that, yes, we expect the hybrid attacks to increase, and that is exactly what we are preparing for. So Russia is basically waging two wars right now. One is kinetic in Ukraine, with, of course, new elements into the conduction of warfare, with glide bombs, with drones, with more technologically sophisticated equipment. And then the other one is hybrid warfare. And in hybrid warfare, you can, of course, look at a range of issues. I mean, you can list anywhere from 10 to 20 to 30 different actions that you can do. And that's why, as an academic or otherwise, I'd say that the line between war and peace has been blurred. So, it's about information wars. It's about potential sabotage attacks. It's about hitting infrastructure. It's about cyber attacks. So there's a big range of things that can be done. And what I'm trying to say for us here in Finland, because usually we're quite cool, calm, and collected about everything.
That is your reputation.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's mine, but
no, it's Finland. Sorry,
but in general, yes. And so my message is that we shouldn't react to everything that comes out of the Kremlin, especially on the information side. Of course, if it is a clear, sabotage attack on our infrastructure, be it a gas pipeline or data line or something like that, or if we see a cyber attack, we're much better, together with Estonia, I look at their military chief here, we're much better at fighting cyber attacks than we were when it actually happened, sort of for the first time in 2007 in Estonia, in the banking system. So we work on a lot of these things, and when I say cool, calm, collected, what it means for me is that first we look at what has happened or what was said. what was said, for instance, about the demarcation of borders. Think before you act. Then, secondly, once you find out what has happened, you look at the different options of who did it. When you find out who did it, that's when you attribute.
Yeah.
And when you do all of this in these 3 steps, you have to be in close cooperation and coordination with your allies.
Yeah.
Because if Russia does the same hybrid attack on the same day with us and say with Estonia, we have to react exactly the same way. Otherwise, they will have won the day. And the same goes also for public discourse. We have to be very careful with what kind of information we circulate into the system. The aim of Russia is try to intimidate, destabilize, and sow the seeds of fear into Finnish society. And we just have to be vigilant and basically understand what is true and what is not.
I'm keen to get questions from the audience. Just a couple more from me. We have a new European Commission, or at least a proposed one. It has a defense commissioner for the first time. You're someone who spent a lot of your career in politics looking at the EU in and around it. How do you feel about that, Europe, the EU taking on a bigger role in defense?
Yeah, I mean, I had a chance to chat a little bit with Ursula von der Leyen as well in New York. I know her many years back, and I, of course, congratulated her on her commission. I think what we're seeing in Europe right now is sort of unforeseen, almost historical unity. I know we always look at disunity and we mention Hungary and so on and so forth, but look, the previous von der Leyen Commission is one of the strongest commissions that we've had since Delors. And what links them? Well, what links them is a big shift in international relations. Yeah. So Delors was there at the end of the 80s, early 90s, end of the Cold War. And of course, von der Leyen is there now when we're seeing a big shift in world politics, not knowing exactly where it's going. And then it becomes crisis management. So, how did Ursula von der Leyen deal with COVID? Well, actually extremely well. How did she deal with the war in Ukraine? Well. How did she deal with the energy crisis? Well. And now it's interesting to see how her second commission would work. To me, it looks like she's set up more of a team than kind of a group of superstar big names, if you know what I mean. And that's why it's going to be interesting to see how they do it. The Brussels bubble, which you live in and you report from, and I read your stuff every day. You probably know it better than I do, but I do think that she starts this commission from a position of strength. But I always say that it's not the president that makes the agenda, it's the agenda that makes the president. So it just depends on what kind of crisis she has to manage in the next 5 years.
I mean, just finally on the defense point, Jens Stoltenberg, the outgoing NATO Secretary General, said last week that any kind of duplication of efforts of NATO is a bad thing. You're a brand new NATO head of state.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, well, Jens and I talk about it a lot. We have to keep in mind that, well, I'll put it in 2 ways. We have to keep in mind that Norway is not a member of the European Union.
Correct.
And you have to keep in mind that for years Finland kept on talking about we need a stronger defense in Europe. Now that we're in NATO, why? No, I mean, I do think, in all seriousness, I do think that the European Union has a role to play.
Sure.
But duplication is something, of course, that we need to avoid. If I may, I'll take a little bit of an issue, Charly and Mikael and others, with the term of the conference, total defense. I would like to talk about comprehensive defense, because that then widens the scope a little bit more towards the European Union.
Right.
And in comprehensive defense, my predecessor, President Niinistö, is now doing a report on that. I think that you fight wars on the battlefield, but you win them in civil society and at home. And we need to, look at resilience and the capacity of our societies to sustain big hits, anywhere from, a weather catastrophe to a war. And the European Union should be good at that. So, and also, I think on defense industry and investment in defense and those kinds of things. But to have duplication of operative structures, I mean, that's no point. It's hard enough for us to integrate our military into the NATO, let alone to the European Union.
Yeah. Well, and also the European Union is calling for targets that NATO have had for decades and people just ignored. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's also a sign of times. I mean, in many ways, I'm good friends with the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Luc Frieden, and I sort of understand why Luxembourg isn't there at the 2% target yet. I mean, when you live next to France and Germany and the Netherlands nowadays, it's kind of a safe place to be. But on the NATO side, it's quite astonishing that in 2014 you had only 3 countries that reached the 2% target. Now we have 23, and I think what we have to prepare for mentally in the alliance, including of course Finland, is that this threshold will increase with time. And that's a sign of times. When you have an external threat, you unite. That happened in NATO, and that happened, of course, in the EU. Final point, that's why I think actually the Helsinki Security Forum is simply so timely, and I'm glad that it was founded, because it just came at a time when geopolitics was back and when security is the only talking town.
Yeah. Well, there could be an internal threat if Donald Trump wins the election. Any questions from the audience? Yes, there's one gentleman here with his hand very highly raised. Could you please introduce yourself and please ask a question? Don't give a speech.
Thanks, Henry.
Oh, hi, Ben.
Good warning, well heeded. Thank you. Benjamin Tallis, Democratic Strategy Initiative, Berlin. President Stubb, it was very good to hear you say that Ukraine's in a better position militarily than it was back in June. It could be better still, we all know that. But if we might be approaching negotiations at some point, one of the key issues is going to be security guarantees or security assurances that will be provided to Ukraine. In your view of the options on the table, which ones would you support?
I think thanks, Ben, and nice to see you live, albeit against the light, so I can't really see you. I think you have to go step by step with these. So what are the steps? Hypothetically, step number 1 are these security arrangements that we've now done with X amount of countries. I think it's reaching almost 20. I think we were Rassa, do you remember, were we number 7 in signing the security arrangements with Ukraine? Something like that.
Top 10.
The US did it. We now have a coalition, et cetera, et cetera. The second step is hard security guarantees. And I actually think they have to be bilateral. And if I was Zelensky, I'd probably want them from the likes of the UK, the US, or France.
Yeah.
And then the third step is, of course, EU membership, which in and of itself, in my mind, is a security guarantee. I know that a lot of hardcore defense specialists would say that, well, they're not real, that Article 42.7, it's not serious, but it's still an institutional security guarantee. And then, of course, the fourth step is NATO membership. So you have to go very, very careful on that. But I have said that what Zelensky needs is 4 things, and I keep on repeating them, but I have to be vague because it's not my decision. The first one is territory. The second one is security guarantees. The third one is justice, so war criminals indicted. And the fourth one is reconstruction. So when he starts working around these and then gets the 10-point peace plan, I think we could get there. But security guarantees have to be there. And that's why I keep on saying, and I'll keep on hammering this down. Ukraine has already won the biggest battle. And the biggest battle was about its independence and its identity. And it's been able to push back the Russification of Ukraine now for over 2.5 years. And it's not going to lose that. Russia is not going to take over Ukraine. Simple as that.
A gentleman here, I think, had a question on the front table.
Yes, Markus Armo, CEO of Fortum Finnish Utility. I have a more practical question. So, Mr. President, you spoke about we spoke about total defense or comprehensive defense, and in order to prepare, you need situational awareness. And you, as in the presidential position, you of course get the information of all security authorities. but this is not necessarily the case in corporate life. So question about the situation awareness, what potential do you see in sharing, let's say, at least semi-public information between the large actors in the society so that we can also direct our preparedness maybe to the more likely threats than the non-likely?
Yeah, no, thanks, Markus. So for those of you who don't come from Finland and are not intimately acquainted with our system of comprehensive defense, it's something that a lot of our allies are looking at very closely right now. So our basic thinking comes from societal resilience. That's why we have civilian bunkers for over 4 million people. That's why we have a security of supply agency led by Janne Känkänen. And I would probably feel that is the place where you get the key information and cooperation, because that agency has, I think, 17, soon 18 contact points. One of the key ones, of course, is on energy supply. So there's a contract, I would assume, with Fortum, with Neste and many others about what kind of storage should be kept and where and how it can be distributed. Then, of course, next we go into the situation room with General Jaakkola and we look at, what are the elements that can be shared with society by and large. I would like to assure you of two things. One is that if there was a situational awareness where Fortum or any other bigger player would need to be informed, that would happen immediately. I mean, we don't have a problem with that. The second one is, I have to say that now that I've been President of the Republic for almost 7 months, and coming back into it, kind of to the information flow, coming back into it after a break of 7 years, I sleep my nights very well. I've been in our logistics center in Tampere. I've been in our situation room. We've looked at our operative plans. I've had conversations with all of the key civil servants in our society, from the head of police to the head of the border guards to the head of our Secret Service to, of course, to the head of our military. And I think the way in which we have structured our society and its resilience is simply impressive. And this is not, I'm not trying to inflate what we have done, but I am simply convinced that there are not too many other countries that are as prepared for a tight situation as we are.
Just to follow up on that, actually, it made me think, how much conversations do you have with other leaders in Europe, heads of state, heads of government, about that thin line between preparing publics for the worst and scaring them? I mean, it sounds like Finland has it just about right, but there are probably other countries in the EU where people are a bit too blasé, and maybe others where they're a bit too jumpy.
Well, it's probably, the closer you are to the Russian border.
I can think of some exceptions.
Yeah. The more prepared you are. I think there's a quite an interesting anecdote here, is that I think once the war began in Ukraine, in Finland, we have tried to calm things down, and I think more or less we've succeeded.
Yeah.
But in Sweden, they printed a pamphlet, what to do in case of war. So there's a slight sort of difference on how you prepare. But in many ways, I think preparedness is an understanding that we have a resilient system, that we have a system that works, that functions, that we are prepared. Because the better prepared you are, the less likely you are to see a bad situation.
Deterrence
is it's the best way. And I think we are sort of, well, now I come to the total defense. I mean, we're prepared for most scenarios, except, of course, the unknown, which can always, happen. Yeah. But I look at our military preparedness, and I keep on repeating this, and I'll do it once again. We are a country with obligatory military service, with 900,000 men and women that have served, with 280,000 that we can mobilize in wartime. We're a country with an air force with 62 F-18s, soon 64 F-35s. We're a country with long-range missiles in the land, air, and sea. We're a country with the biggest artillery in Europe, together with Poland. And we don't have these because we're worried about Sweden. You know.
Any more questions in the room? Is that a hand there? The lights are very bright. I think there is one there. Yeah.
Thank you, Henry. Sergei Utkin, University of Southern Denmark. Mr. President, you lately made a number of very far-reaching remarks on UN reform. I have a twofold question on that. As an academic, you perfectly know all the hurdles for any substantial UN reform. So if it is basically impossible, especially when it comes to veto right of permanent members of the UN Security Council, does it make sense at all to start this discussion? And if it is blocked indeed, what could be plan B for multilateralism on the global level that you talked about?
Yeah, so the starting point for suggesting reform and doing it concretely on the basis of multilateralism is that we are right now retracting from multilateralism precisely at a time when we need it more than ever. Conflicts, climate change, migration, sustainable development, technology. They're all global goods which we can't solve alone. And what we're seeing is this, as I said, multipolar disorder where nation states don't anymore abide by rules. And then you come to the question, do we have another institution apart from the UN that could do it? And the answer is no. If the answer is no, you have to understand that it needs to be reformed. Now, realism or not, I basically made three proposals. One was to double the number of members in the Permanent Security Council from 5 to 10, and that would be 1 from Latin America, 2 from Asia, and 2 from Africa. We would still maintain the 10 elected members, which would mean that in the most important multilateral institution in the world, you would have 10% of the world's countries at any given time in the UN Security Council. I think that's a suggestion that could fly. I genuinely believe that. And certainly, you know, if you listen to countries from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, they say, yep, let's go for it.
Sure.
And many others as well. The second suggestion, scrapping the veto power. There, I understand that it's probably unrealistic, but we have to understand and point out that one of the reasons that the UN on a political level is often dysfunctional is because of the veto power. If you look at all the agencies of the UN, of which there are roughly 20, we forget that the IMF, we forget the WHO, etc. They're UN agencies. They actually work quite well. They don't have a veto power. So I'm sure there'll be a big sort of fight about, as there is in the EU about, scrapping unanimity. And then my third suggestion, I'm still optimistic about that, which was that if you, as a UN Security Council member, violate the UN Charter, your voting rights should be suspended. That was the one that I got applause from in the General Assembly, which in the General Assembly you don't get applause. So there was a lot of traction, I think, for the suggestions, and they follow pretty much the Nordic line, perhaps Nordic line plus. And I will see. We'll see what happens. I'm still hopeful because either we reform or then we don't exist. I mean, it's as simple as that.
There was a lady here in the blue who was waving her arms. Yep, there. Yes, next to the camera.
Thank you so much. My name is Veronica. I am a reporter for Political Europe based in Ukraine, and I came here from Kyiv. I wanted to ask you, you said you saw Zelensky victory plan, right?
No, I didn't. No.
Okay, so we got a glance in Kyiv before his meeting, and one of the points is NATO invitation as soon as possible. With the current state of affairs, do you think it's realistic for Ukraine to get this until the end of the year? Thank you so much.
Till the end of the year, I would think it's unrealistic. But in the long run, I think it's realistic. I think the sort of sequence will be EU membership first and NATO membership second. And of course, sometimes it's a long path towards one or the other, or both. But as I said, I think we should look at the sequence of security arrangements, bilateral security, guarantees. Then after that, we need to get EU membership, and after that, NATO membership. Finland's position is that we support Ukraine's NATO membership together with the alliance. But the timing, of course, has to be right. And as we all know, a country that is in a war situation cannot be taken into the alliance. May I add to that? Have faith. It's going to happen. You know, it's not. Don't hang everything onto getting the invitation now. It is going to happen. It's a step-by-step process. Russia wanted to avoid at all costs getting NATO to its borders. It got Finland, it got Sweden, it will get Ukraine, and all of those countries that want to join the alliance.
But if it can't join while it's in a conflict, that gives Russia every incentive to never stop.
I don't think so. There will come a point where the war has to end. Wars always end at some stage. Of course, you know, what makes it so horrific is that there seems to be no limits to what Putin and his regime are willing to sacrifice in the face of this war. There is this sort of combination, unfortunately, of time to time incompetence combined with indifference.
Yeah.
And that is probably one of the most dangerous combinations that you can have when you feel that you have eternal resources. You pay the public, the families of the dead or injured soldiers, so much that they keep quiet. But at some point, this will end. And in that sense, I think that NATO membership right now is not what's going to end it.
Yes, question here, gentlemen. Just hold on 1 second, we'll get you a microphone.
Derek Shear, I'm the former U.S. ambassador to Finland. And I wanted to ask the president, since you've studied in the United States and you know the country well, how worried are you about what is going on in the U.S.? And do you think if things go badly in our election, that Europe could go it alone?
No, hi, Derek. Nice to see you. Yeah, I mean, I've always been an amateur of American politics ever since I studied at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm Finnish by birth and Southern by the grace of God. In 1989 to 1993. What worries me most in the U.S. right now is the level of polarity that we can see in society, how binary it has become. And of course, as a sequence to that, what worries me is that we're starting to see similar tendencies in other liberal democracies in Europe. My take on the election is that it's very much a toss of a coin. It's the American public that decides. And the optimist in me says that the United States wants to remain a superpower. Therefore, it needs allies. And the strongest allies are values-based allies, not interest-based allies. And they, of course, come from Europe. Of course, there is a difference in the rhetoric of the two candidates vis-à-vis Ukraine. And I think there is a general understanding in Europe, regardless of the election result, that we will have to take more responsibility, not only of our own defense, but also of our own security. I, however, belong to the category of people who want to see the United States engaged, not only in Europe, but in the world. Because historically, and I don't want to over-rationalize, when the United States isolates itself from the rest of the world, doesn't take the space of power that it is given to or that it usually takes, it doesn't lead to good things. We saw that before World War I. We saw that before World War II. What happened when the Cold War ended was sort of this, intellectual laziness with all of us. We thought that, okay, here we have a unipolar world led by the United States, and all of the countries in the world are going to revert towards some kind of liberal democracy, globalization, social market economy. But it didn't happen. We forgot that we have to contain the bad elements of mankind and of nation states. But yes, I am worried about the polarization of American society. And I don't say this as a Southerner. I just look and listen. I mean, I just give you an example. I mean, I used to think that Rush Limbaugh was extreme, right? Yeah. And now it's sort of kind of mainstream. I thought it was, an interesting oddity at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. May he rest in peace. But now, when I go on American TV channels, which I did CBS, Fox, and CNN this time around, there's a slight twist in the approach that they take, and I kind of want to avoid that. And I think at the end of the day, and sorry for a slightly long answer, the big problem is that liberal democracy has not adjusted to modern technology. We are not able to cope and have a civilized dialogue anymore in the way in which we used to when things were slower. Klaus alluded to it earlier. We were actually able to do that quite well in the presidential elections here in Finland. The reason is that for us, foreign policy is existential. But we see elements in national politics where there is strong sort of polarization between the left and the right, so conservatives and liberals. And we see that in the US as well. Final point. The big worry I have is that we're not capable to have fact-based discussions anymore. When truth becomes irrelevant, when facts become irrelevant, and you believe in something which is not true, and an algorithm feeds that truth to you, you lose autonomy and your own capacity to think. And that we're seeing some elements of in the US elections. Nothing matters anymore. Indifference is a bad thing for democracy.
Mr. President, that's a bit of a dour note to end on, but end we must, sadly. We could talk for hours, but we need to get you off the stage, apparently. So
I can go home and sleep, no?
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening and for your questions. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Sure, I think we...